When we talk about fantasy, fantasy is a subgenre of speculative fiction that features magical or supernatural elements that do not exist in the real world. They're inspired by myths and folklore. They may include beings inspired by traditional stories such as dragons, elves, sorcerers, or other magical creatures. They use magic or supernatural elements as a main plot element, theme, or setting. It's important to the story. And they don't have to follow the laws of nature. They still need to follow the laws of the story or the world that the author has created, but they don't have to follow the laws of nature as we know them. And it's a very broad genre. It can incorporate all sorts of things. It's probably one of the most broad genres that we've studied this year. It appeals to readers primarily as escapism. So it's an opportunity to lose yourself in your imagination where anything is possible. Readers want stories that will take them to a world not like this one. Tamora Pierce has this to say about fantasy. Fantasy, more than any other genre, is a literature of empowerment. In the real world, kids have little say. This is a given. It is the nature of childhood. In fantasy, however short, fat, unbeautiful, weak, dreamy, or unlearned individuals may be, they find a realm in which those things are negated by strength. The catch is that empowerment brings trials. In good novels, heroes and heroines contend as much with their granted wishes as readers do in normal life. Fantasy has a very long history. It goes back to 1200 BC to mythological stories and the oral tradition, where stories were passed down by oral tradition by just speaking them and people listening to them and memorizing them and being able to repeat them from generation to generation. And one of the oldest fantasies is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the 100 to 200s, fairy tales were recorded in print across various cultures. In the 1400s, we have King Arthur and his legends retold by Sir Thomas Malory. Alice in Wonderland was printed in 1865, so we're getting into the Victorian era. 1904, Peter Pan. In 1923, in the US, the first all fantasy magazine was published called Weird Tales. It consisted of fantasy and horror stories. It was pulp fiction, so these were very cheap magazines, very easy to purchase because they were affordable. And sometimes they would run an episode at a time. So it wouldn't be a complete story, it would be an ongoing story, and you'd read a chapter in each magazine that you bought. In the 1950s, The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia popularized fantasy novels. That is largely recognized as sort of the on ramp to fantasy novels for young adults. In 1997, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was another turning point in the development of fantasy novels. That's the title it was published under in the United Kingdom. J.K. Rowling changed things for fantasy in the publishing industry. The popularity of Harry Potter and the amount of money that that brought into the publisher and to the bookstores really caught the attention of publishers, and they started giving more serious consideration to manuscripts of fantasy stories that they received that they had been getting all along but had just not taken as seriously. So when they saw that there was a market for it and money to be made, they started opening up that area of novel development. In 2005, Twilight popularized vampire novels. We had a whole series of those that came out, and it's become increasingly popular in multimedia formats, movies and video games and toys and cosplay. Fantasy is just blowing up. Here are some common fantasy subgenres that we mentioned. When we talk about tropes in fantasy, there is one of the most common is a magical being gaining self-awareness. This is usually a teenage protagonist and they're coming of age. So they're learning how to manage their magical powers, how they work, and it's trial and error, and there's a lot of uncertainty that parallels that passage in adolescent development, and that is the most common trope. The battle between good and evil is another very common trope that you'll see in fantasy novels. Hero's journey or quest. And that gets woven in with a lot of stories. Even if that is not the main story, a lot of stories will have a quest aspect to them. Independence, coming to a point of separating yourself from an evil organization or finding your own way in the world or leaving your country or area of life. All that gets woven into stories pretty commonly too. Transformation is another thing that is woven throughout stories. You're changing from one thing to another, or you're bringing about change in your society. That can come up too. Races and species, that comes into play when authors are creating their own worlds and their own world building stories. It gets very developed. People develop lots of races and species that have never been thought of before, and sometimes they're purely imaginative, and other times the authors are trying to use them to represent groups of people in our own society to comment on that or make you think about their place in the world. The damsel in distress is an old trope from the original stories of maidens needing to be rescued. But as history has changed over time and as our sensibilities about things have changed, this has become less popular. And so now it's transforming into the damsel in distress flips the script to empower herself. And this is often through a magic power or through learning how to do something. School or training to master newly realized powers. This is where Harry Potter comes in. Magical schools did not originate with Harry Potter, but that's the best known example of that. There's frequently magical characters who are in a school or academy or training program to master their powers. When we look at common writing styles, they're plot driven stories, especially if they're a quest. They have to go on a specific trip and they meet hardships along the way and address them. Plot driven. Genre blending, you'll see in any of these genres and subgenres. They often borrow from mythology. That's frequent. Lots of transformation of characters from one thing to another through magic, and they're emotionally intense. That emotional intensity is kind of what sucks readers in. Marjorie N. Allen said fantasies often have more to do with reality than any so called realistic fiction. Fantasy touches on universal truths. So, this idea that when you're reading fantasy, you're not just escaping reality, you're thinking about reality in different ways. And it allows you to be more critical about the things that you see in life and more aware of the things that you see in life as a result of your interaction with a story. When you're looking at how to measure quality in fantasy novels, the detail of world building is important to consider. And that doesn't have to be 7,000 details. It can be 5 different things in that world that are just really paid attention to. So it's not that you need a more involved, more detailed world. You just need the world that you have created to be detailed enough to be clearly understood by the reader and visualized. Creativity and imagination. Original, is it an original story or is it the same as 3 other novels that you've read about kings and kingdoms? Strong characterization. Characters in fantasy should be really well developed, and they frequently are. That tends to be a strength of this genre. Plot consistency is important, especially with world building. When the world is built a certain way, it needs to make sense. And if, as a reader, you're going along and there's a part that is inconsistent with the world that's been created, it's like hitting a speed bump while you're reading. This genre is not without criticisms. They can lack depth. They can be childish tales without any substance. It was a neat idea, but the writer didn't take the time to go deep and develop it. They just skimmed the surface with the story, and it was a flimsy tale instead of being a well-developed one. Lack of representation or diversity. Typically, it's just a very white genre, and that has been changing in the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a lot more representation of all different types of diversity. Plot flaws or contradictions are common enough to be a point of criticism for the genre, and censors may object to the use of magic and say that it has a negative influence on young readers. So, oftentimes, fantasy books are on censored book lists when there's magic involved, and Harry Potter has certainly been a good example of that. That has been banned many, many times in places. Trends within fantasy, there's increasing diversity in characters and sources, especially in the area of mythologies from different cultures and in the area of representing characters with various forms of ability. Feminism is a trend in fantasy. Female empowerment and strong heroines, girl gangs, or groups of women fighting for change. Sweeping fantasies, entirely made up worlds and societies, not just a world that's sort of like ours and has one thing different, but totally different worlds that you don't know anything about except as the writer presents to you in the book. This ties in with escapism. A lot of what's happening now in fantasy novels is responding to the pandemic and people needing a break and needing a sweeping fantasy to get caught up in.